On the evening of May 30th, 2010, a young woman full of life and ambition stepped into one of Lima's most well-known casino hotels, carrying with her not just a competitive spirit but a heart full of hope. Her name was Stephanie Flores Ramirez, and she was just 21 years old. Stephanie was the kind of person who lit up every room she walked into, warm, quick-witted, and fiercely independent for someone her age. She had grown up in a household where hard work and character were valued above everything else, and that upbringing had shaped her into someone her family was endlessly proud of. That evening, she had made her way to the Atlanta City Casino in Lima, Peru, to compete in a poker tournament. Poker was not just a hobby for Stephanie, it was something she had a genuine talent for. Only a few days before that night, she had walked away from a game $10,000 richer, and that win had given her every reason to feel confident. She had called her father before heading out, telling him in a casual, reassuring tone that she would be gone for a couple of days and back home before he knew it. It was the kind of offhand goodbye that families exchange 1,000 times without a second thought. No one in the Flores household had any reason to believe that those words would be the last normal exchange they would ever have with her. The Flores family was one of the most recognized names in Peruvian society. Stephanie's father, Ricardo Flores, was a celebrated motorsport figure and had even entered the political arena as a presidential candidate in Peru, earning him a reputation that stretched far beyond the racing circuit. Despite their prominent standing, the family was known for being grounded, approachable, and deeply connected to one another. Ricardo had 5 children, 4 sons, and 1 daughter, and Stephanie, being the youngest and the only girl, held a very special place in everyone's heart. Her brothers were protective of her in the way that older siblings often are, and her parents cherished her with an affection that she seemed to wear lightly but always appreciate. Her 4 brothers had moved into the events industry together, building something of a small enterprise, while Stephanie was pursuing a business administration degree at a university in Lima, working alongside her brothers part-time and continuing to refine her skills at the poker table. By any measure, she was on a path that her family could be proud of. She was disciplined, goal-oriented, and smart about money in a way that belied her youth. When Stephanie did not come home after the tournament, her father Ricardo was the first to notice. It was not like her to disappear without a word. She was responsible, perhaps more responsible than most young women her age, and the absence of a phone call or a message was jarring enough to send a chill through him almost immediately. He reached out to her brothers, who also found that their calls to Stephanie were going unanswered. The family began working the phones, contacting every friend, every acquaintance, anyone who might have seen her or spoken to her after the tournament, but nobody had anything useful to offer. Her brothers drove around the city looking for her, checking the places she frequented, asking questions at every stop. Still nothing. Eventually, with options running out and anxiety tightening its grip on the household, Ricardo made the call to the police and formally reported his daughter missing. Officers were dispatched to the Atlanta City Casino Hotel, the last confirmed location where Stephanie had been. Staff at the hotel were cooperative, but could not offer a clear picture of what had happened to her after the evening ended. Detectives requested access to the hotel's security camera footage, and the review of those recordings would prove to be the first critical turning point in the investigation. The footage from a corridor near the conference room where the poker tournament had been held showed Stephanie arriving shortly before 3 in the morning on May 30th. She settled into a seat at one of the tables, and sitting nearby was a young man dressed in light-colored clothing who was already there when she arrived. The two appeared relaxed and friendly throughout the session, engaged in casual conversation, the way strangers often become acquaintances over a shared game. When the tournament wound down around 5 in the morning, the two were seen leaving the area together. Hotel staff who had been working that night later recalled seeing them and described the young man as polite and easygoing. One staff member went so far as to note that the stranger bore a physical resemblance to actor Brad Pitt, which was the detail that had lodged him in their memory. But beyond that superficial observation, no one had paid the encounter much more attention. It had looked like nothing more than 2 people who had enjoyed a night at the casino and were heading off somewhere together. Detectives continued combing through the surveillance recordings, tracking the couple's movements through the hotel. The footage was clear. At approximately 5:16 in the morning, Stephanie and the unidentified man entered room 309 together. The cameras then captured the man leaving the room briefly and returning a short time later, carrying 2 cups of coffee and some pastries, a detail that, in its ordinary domesticity, made what came next all the more disturbing. 3 hours and 20 minutes after they had first walked through that door together, the man left the room again. This time he was carrying a backpack and he did not return. On his way out, he instructed hotel staff not to disturb the woman in his room. Staff members honored that request without question, and no one checked on Stephanie until the police arrived. When investigators finally entered room 309, What they found shattered every remaining hope the Flores family had been holding on to. Stephanie was found unresponsive inside the room, and it was immediately apparent that a violent incident had taken place. The scene was deeply disturbing. Evidence at the location pointed clearly to a physical struggle of considerable force. Among the items recovered by investigators was a tennis racket, which they believed had been used as a weapon during the attack. A forensic examination later conducted by the medical examiner revealed the full extent of the injuries Stephanie had sustained. She had suffered a broken neck, severe trauma to the left side of her head, bleeding from the ear and nose, signs of strangulation, and blunt force trauma to the back of the skull and lower neck. The blunt impact had caused significant internal brain injury, which the medical examiner determined was the direct cause of her death. Stephanie was found fully clothed and lying on her back. Investigators ruled out any element of sexual assault after examining the physical evidence, closing that avenue of inquiry early in the case. What remained was the question of motive, and it did not take long for one answer to surface. The young man in the surveillance footage had left the room with Stephanie's belongings, her cash, her cards, and her jewelry. She had been carrying a substantial sum of money that night, approximately $15,000 in total, $10,000 of which she had won at recent tournaments, and $5,000 of which her father had given her specifically to purchase a new laptop. The theft of that money pointed strongly toward robbery as the central motive, though investigators were careful to keep all possibilities open as they worked the case. One of the most important developments in the investigation came when detectives ran the name associated with room 309. The room had been registered under the name Joran van der Sloot. He was identified as a 22-year-old Dutch national. When police began pulling background information on him, what they found immediately elevated the urgency of their investigation to an entirely new level. Joran van der Sloot was not an unknown quantity to international law enforcement. He had spent years as a central figure in one of the most haunting and widely followed missing persons cases in recent memory, the disappearance of an 18-year-old American girl named Natalie Holloway, who had vanished without a trace on the Caribbean island of Aruba on May 30, 2005. The date was not lost on investigators. Natalie Holloway had disappeared exactly 5 years to the day before Stephanie Flores was found dead in Lima. That coincidence alone sent a ripple of unease through the investigation team. A warrant was issued for Van der Sloot's arrest, and an active search was launched to locate him. His whereabouts were unknown, and investigators had no way of knowing yet how far he had managed to travel. While the manhunt was underway, detectives spent time building a fuller picture of the Natalie Holloway case in order to better understand the man they were looking for. Natalie Holloway had been born on October 21, 1986 in Clinton, Mississippi. She was the eldest child in her family. Her parents had divorced when she was 7 years old, and she and her siblings had remained in their mother's care while maintaining a warm relationship with their father. When Natalie was 14, her mother remarried a successful businessman, and the family relocated to Mountain Brook, Alabama. By all accounts, Natalie was an exceptional young woman. She was an honors student, a cheerleader, a dancer, and someone who moved through her school years with both grace and determination. She graduated at the top of her class and had already secured a full scholarship to the University of Alabama, where she was set to begin her studies that coming fall. Her future looked genuinely bright, and the people around her regarded her as someone destined for great things. In late May of 2005, Natalie joined a graduation trip that had been organized for her class. The trip took the group to Aruba, a Dutch constituent island in the southern Caribbean that had earned a reputation as one of the safest destinations in the region. Crime was historically rare there, and the island's relaxed, welcoming atmosphere made it a popular choice for vacationing Americans. 124 students and 11 chaperones made the trip together, staying at the Holiday Inn Resort under an all-inclusive arrangement. The days that followed were exactly what a graduation trip was supposed to be: carefree, celebratory, and full of the particular joy that comes from knowing that one chapter is closing and a bigger one is about to begin. The group spent their days on the beach, swimming in the blue-green waters, lounging, laughing, and simply enjoying the kind of freedom that felt earned after years of hard work. In the evenings, they visited the casino and the hotel bar, sampling cocktails and enjoying the nightlife that Aruba's tourism infrastructure was designed to provide. May 29, 2005 was the final evening of the trip. Everyone was in a slightly different headspace that night. There was the excitement of going home mixed with the bittersweetness of the trip ending. Natalie had packed her belongings and arranged her passport near her suitcase, ready to be picked up in the morning. The group had dinner together, and afterward, as students often do on the last night of a trip, they split off in different directions. Some went back to their rooms to get a good night's sleep before the early flight, while others stayed out a little longer, reluctant to let the vacation end. The next morning, when the group gathered in the hotel lobby to check out and make their way to the airport, teachers began doing a head count. One name did not get a response. Natalie Holloway was nowhere to be found. A teacher called her room phone, assuming she might simply have overslept. There was no answer. Staff members accompanied chaperones to her room and opened the door. Natalie was not there, but everything she owned was her suitcase, her belongings, her passport. She had not left voluntarily and with plans to stay. Something else had happened. The hotel was searched top to bottom, inside and out. Staff combed every corridor, every common area, every corner of the property. No trace of Natalie was found. Around 11 in the morning, a teacher placed a call to Natalie's mother, Bate Twitty, back in Alabama. The news that her daughter had vanished on the final night of the trip sent Bate into a state of controlled, determined urgency that would define the years ahead of her. She and Natalie's stepfather boarded a private plane almost immediately, arriving in Aruba within hours. Bate arrived at the island with the energy of someone who was not going to wait for anyone. She had photographs of Natalie, and she began showing them around, asking questions, pressing for answers. Local authorities opened a missing persons investigation. The Aruban police began interviewing the students and chaperones who had been on the trip, and what emerged was a picture of Natalie's last known hours. According to multiple witnesses, Natalie had spent time at a local bar and nightclub called Carlos and Charlie's on that final evening. She had been seen in the company of 3 young men. One of them was Joran van der Sloot, a tall, English-speaking Dutch teenager who was living on Aruba at the time because his father was studying to become a judge there. The other 2 were brothers Deepak and Satish Kalpo, who were local residents. Witnesses described seeing Natalie leave the establishment with these 3 men late in the evening. Joran and the Kalpo brothers became the primary persons of interest almost immediately. All 3 were brought in for questioning. Their stories shifted and changed over the course of multiple interviews, which did not inspire confidence in their truthfulness. Joran, in one early account, claimed that he and the Kalpo brothers had dropped Natalie off at her hotel at the end of the night and that she had been seen walking toward the entrance, where she was approached by a security guard. That story was quickly contradicted by security footage showing no such interaction had taken place. The Aruban authorities made multiple arrests in the days and weeks that followed. The Kalpo brothers were detained, then released. Joran was arrested more than once over the course of the investigation, held for extended periods, and ultimately released each time due to insufficient evidence to formally charge him under Aruban law. With each arrest and release, the frustration of Natalie's family and the American public grew more palpable. Bate Twitty became a relentless and visible advocate, making media appearances and keeping pressure on Aruban authorities with a persistence that brought international attention to her daughter's case. The investigation stretched on through the summer of 2005 and into the fall, then into the following year. Searches were conducted across the island on the beach, in the water, in dense vegetation, and in locations that witnesses had pointed to at various times. Nothing definitive was ever found. Divers were brought in to search the waters near the shoreline where Natalie had last been seen. Cadaver dogs were deployed. None of it yielded any physical trace of her. In September 2005, with the investigation stalled and no charges filed against anyone, Aruban authorities formally suspended the active search. It was a devastating blow to the Holloway family, who had never stopped believing that answers were close. Back in the Netherlands, Joran van der Sloot returned to his life. He enrolled at a university in the Netherlands, but the shadow of the Natalie Holloway case followed him wherever he went. His behavior during this period was erratic and troubling. He gave television interviews in which he made contradictory, and in some cases, deeply provocative statements about the night Natalie disappeared. In a 2008 documentary filmed through a hidden camera, he appeared to claim that Natalie had become unconscious in his presence on the beach, and that he had called a friend who helped him dispose of her body in the ocean. He later tried to retract those statements, claiming they had been fabricated. The recording was broadcast internationally and reignited public outrage over the case, but it was not enough to support a prosecution under the legal standards applicable in the Netherlands or Aruba at the time. In a subsequent development that revealed even more about his character, Joran van der Sloot contacted Natalie's father, Dave Holloway, with an offer that was as calculated as it was callous. He told the family that he knew where Natalie's remains were located, and that he would share that information in exchange for an advance payment of $25,000. Investigators, working with the FBI, determined that these messages were in fact coming from Joran himself. Dave Holloway, willing to pursue any lead that might finally bring his daughter home, agreed to the terms and made the payment during a meeting with Joran on the island of Aruba. At the meeting, Joran offered yet another new version of events. He now claimed that Natalie had been alive when he was with her, that she had asked to be let go, and that he had released her, but when she fell, she struck her head on a rock and died from the impact. He said his father had helped him bury her beneath the foundation of a house. When police investigated this claim, they determined it was false. The house Joran had pointed to had already been fully constructed at the time of Natalie's disappearance, making it physically impossible for her to have been buried there. Shortly after the meeting, Dave Holloway received an email from Joran admitting that he had fabricated the entire story. With that, Joran van der Sloot had not only failed to provide any real information about Natalie's fate, he had committed a federal crime in the process. Working alongside the FBI, the Holloway family filed the necessary complaints to support charges of wire fraud and extortion. An indictment was eventually brought against him. Before he could be taken into custody in connection with those charges, however, Joran van der Sloot had already fled to South America, and specifically to Peru, where he was staying in Lima when Stephanie Flores crossed his path. On June 3, 2010, just days after Stephanie was found, the Lima police received a phone tip that proved decisive. The call came from a former girlfriend of Joran van der Sloot. She explained that Joran had been in contact with her recently, asking to borrow money to cover the cost of a plane ticket. Rather than help him, she contacted authorities and gave them everything she knew about his possible location. Police determined that Joran had made his way out of Peru by traveling across the border into Chile, covering the distance in 2 separate taxis in what appeared to be a desperate and disorganized attempt to disappear. He was taken into custody by Chilean authorities before he could book a flight out of the country. When officers who arrested him noted the condition of his clothing, they found visible signs of blood still present. In his rush to flee Lima, he had not taken the time to change. He was extradited back to Peru without delay, and formal charges of killing Stephanie Flores were presented against him. During his initial police interrogation, Joran van der Sloot denied any responsibility. He told investigators that while he and Stephanie had been in his hotel room, armed intruders had broken in, stolen her valuables and his, and fatally wounded the young woman before he managed to escape. He claimed that the traces of blood found on his clothing had come from Stephanie during the chaos of the supposed robbery. Detectives were not persuaded. The hotel's security footage showed no signs of any intruders entering or leaving room 309 that morning. No other guests or staff had reported hearing anything unusual, and critically, Stephanie had not been fatally wounded in the way his story described. The account collapsed under its own inconsistencies, and 4 days after his arrest, Joran van der Sloot abandoned his denial and provided a confession. In that confession, he described the sequence of events that had taken place in room 309 in the early morning hours of May 30th. He said that after he and Stephanie entered the room, things had initially been calm and relaxed between them. At some point, he claimed, Stephanie picked up his laptop and began browsing its contents. What she found there, according to his account, was information about the Natalie Holloway case and his alleged role in her disappearance. He said he tried to explain himself, insisting to Stephanie that the information was misleading and that he had nothing to do with Natalie's fate. But Stephanie was frightened. She did not believe him. In her fear, she struck him across the face and attempted to flee the room. His response to that, by his own admission, was violent and deliberate. He attacked her, striking her, and then strangling her with increasing force as she fought back. Blood was present throughout the struggle, including on his shirt, which he removed and pressed against her face in what investigators understood as an attempt to silence and restrain her. He did not stop until she was no longer moving. He expressed some degree of remorse in his statement, attributing what had happened to alcohol and what he described as a loss of control provoked by her reaction. He said he had been afraid she would alert the police to his history. Investigators, however, drew a more straightforward conclusion. The theft of Stephanie's $15,000 pointed strongly to robbery as at least a contributing motive, if not the primary one. Understanding that a lengthy sentence in a Peruvian prison now awaited him, Joran van der Sloot attempted to leverage what little he had left to offer. Through his attorney, he proposed a deal. In exchange for the dismissal of all charges against him in Peru, he would lead American authorities to the location of Natalie Holloway's remains. The offer was rejected. No agreement was reached, and the case against him proceeded to trial. The courtroom proceedings moved relatively quickly given the weight of the evidence. Prosecutors presented the hotel surveillance footage showing Joran and Stephanie entering room 309 together, and Joran departing alone hours later. Forensic evidence placed him physically at the scene of her death. Traces of blood from the victim were found on his wrist, and biological material recovered from the scene was matched to him through DNA testing. His own legal counsel, recognizing that the case against their client was overwhelming, advised him to enter a guilty plea with the expectation of a reduced sentence. Joran followed that advice. He was found guilty of the killing of Stephanie Flores and sentenced to 28 years in a Peruvian prison. He was also ordered to pay $75,000 in compensation to the Flores family. The sentence far exceeded what his attorney had led him to expect, and he responded to the verdict with visible anger, directing blame at both his legal counsel and the investigating officers, alleging that his confession had been coerced. A determination was also made that upon completing his sentence in Peru, Joran van der Sloot would be extradited to the United States to face the federal fraud and extortion charges connected to his dealings with the Holloway family. In the years that followed his conviction, Joran van der Sloot's life in custody took a series of unexpected turns. In 2014, while serving his sentence, he met a 33-year-old Peruvian woman named Lady Figueroa, who regularly visited the prison facility to sell goods to inmates. The two developed a relationship, and Joran eventually proposed marriage. They wed, and not long after, the couple welcomed a daughter together, whom they named Ruddy van der Sloot, honoring Joran's mother, Trudy. Prison regulations at the facility where he was held at the time were relatively permissive, and Lady was able to visit him twice each week. She spoke publicly about him in glowing terms, describing him as kind and gentle, a portrayal that many who had followed his case found difficult to reconcile with the facts. By 2020, however, the relationship had fallen apart. Joran reportedly ended the marriage and turned his attention toward a younger woman in her mid-20s named Eva. His involvement with Eva took a criminal direction when investigators determined that the two had been using their contact to facilitate the smuggling of prohibited substances into the prison. When those activities were uncovered, Joran was handed an additional 7-year sentence for drug distribution, and he was transferred to a more restrictive facility where conjugal and contact visits were no longer permitted. He continued to correspond by letter with Eva and with other women who had written to him from outside, but his physical circumstances had become considerably more confined. Through all of this, the question that had never been answered remained exactly where it had always been. Joran van der Sloot was never formally charged in connection with Natalie Holloway's disappearance. No remains were ever recovered. No definitive account of what happened to her that night in May of 2005 was ever established through legal proceedings. The case remained officially unsolved. But within the communities that had followed it most closely, and above all within the Holloway and Twitty families, there was a conviction that had never wavered. The people of Aruba who had watched the investigation unfold largely shared the view that Joran and the two Calpo brothers had been operating in a pattern presenting themselves as charming, well-connected young men to wealthy visiting tourists, particularly young American women, and exploiting that trust for financial gain. Joran, fluent in English and attractive by conventional standards, was seen as the central figure in that dynamic, while the brothers served in more peripheral roles. The family of Natalie Holloway believed deeply that their daughter had been targeted through a similar approach, and that whatever had happened in the course of that encounter had ended her life. Whether events had spiraled out of control in a confrontation over money, or whether something more calculated had occurred, was something they could not prove but had long since stopped doubting. The story of Stephanie Flores, another young woman who had met Joran van der Sloot in a casino, left with him in the early morning hours, and never returned, did nothing but deepen that conviction. The parallels between the two cases were not lost on anyone. In a development that brought a measure of renewed focus to the Holloway family's long wait for justice, Peruvian authorities made a significant announcement. Though the original agreement had been for Joran to remain in Peru until the completion of his full sentence before being extradited to the United States, that position was revised. By the spring of 2023, Peruvian officials had agreed to a temporary transfer. Joran van der Sloot would be handed over to American federal authorities to face the fraud and extortion charges arising from his dealings with the Holloway family, after which he would be returned to Peru to continue serving his sentence for the killing of Stephanie Flores. The decision was driven in part by the practical reality that key witnesses in the American case were aging, and waiting another decade or more for the Peruvian sentence to run its course was simply not a viable option for a fair prosecution. Peru's ambassador to the United States expressed the sincere hope that the extradition would help bring some measure of resolution to the Holloway family, acknowledging that their grief had endured just as long and just as painfully as that of the Flores family. Joran, through his attorneys, sought to block the transfer, arguing that he had not been properly notified of the extradition proceedings in advance and that his rights had been violated in the process. The courts rejected his challenge. In late May of 2023, just before the transfer was carried out, Joran van der Sloot was violently assaulted by other inmates at the Peruvian facility where he was being held. The attack left him with visible injuries, though it did not delay the proceedings. In early June of 2023, FBI agents traveled to Peru to take custody of him personally. A Bureau aircraft was used to transport him back to the United States. On June 8, 2023, the plane carrying Joran van der Sloot touched down on American soil for the first time. He was taken to a detention facility in Birmingham, Alabama, a city intimately connected to the memory of Natalie Holloway, whose family had long called that area home. For the people who had followed this story across 18 years, watching a man who had avoided American justice for so long finally arrive in a courtroom in the state where Natalie had grown up carried a weight that was difficult to put into words. For Bate Twitty and the rest of the family, it was not the ending they had always hoped for, the ending that would have brought their daughter home and given her a proper farewell. But it was, at last, a step forward. The case against him in the United States was moving, and the people who had waited the longest for accountability were watching every moment of it.